The first signal came at 4:17 local time, picked up by a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon flying a routine maritime patrol pattern over the northern Gulf. Below the aircraft, in the shallow waters off Bandar Abbas, the surface of the sea was no longer empty. Hundreds of small radar returns blinked across the operator's screen in a formation no commercial traffic would ever produce. Tight columns, coordinated turns, synchronized acceleration. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy had just rolled out what would become, within hours, the largest single public display of fast assault boats in the history of the Strait of Hormuz. By sunrise, Iranian state television was broadcasting the imagery worldwide. Hundreds of hulls, painted in mottled gray and desert tan, slicing across the water in tight wedge formations. Speedboats armed with anti-ship missiles. Catamaran-hulled craft built for high-speed intercept. Suicide drone boats waiting silently in the second echelon. The message to the world was simple, theatrical, and deliberate. Iran wanted everyone watching. But what people think happened that morning is not the real story. The visible layer was the parade. The hidden layer was the response. Because within 90 minutes of the first Iranian footage hitting international news desks, U.S. Naval Forces Central Command in Manama had already issued a quiet repositioning order. And what moved in response did not appear on any Iranian broadcast. It did not appear on cable news. It did not appear in the press briefings that followed. It moved underneath the visible event, in a layer most observers never see. To understand what really happened in the Strait of Hormuz that week, you have to understand what Iran was actually trying to do and what the United States was actually trying to prevent. The public interpretation was straightforward. Iran was flexing, a show of force, a reminder that the world's most critical oil choke point, through which roughly 20 million barrels of crude transit every day, sits within rifle range of Iranian territory. Analysts on television called it intimidation theater. Commentators called it propaganda. Some dismissed it as a domestic political signal aimed at audiences inside Tehran. All of those readings were partially correct, and all of them missed the deeper question. Because the real question was not why Iran revealed the boats. The real question was why Iran revealed them now, in this configuration, at this scale, in this specific waterway, at this specific moment in the regional escalation cycle. And the answer to that question sits underneath everything that followed. The Strait of Hormuz is, in operational terms, a knife edge. At its narrowest point, it measures just 21 nautical miles across, with the navigable shipping channels compressed into two lanes only 2 miles wide each, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. Tankers transit it slowly, predictably, and with almost no room to maneuver. On the northern shore sits Iran, with mountains overlooking the sea, dotted with anti-ship missile batteries, radar stations and underground tunnel complexes carved directly into the cliffs of Keshem Island and the Hormuzgan coastline. Iran's fast attack boat doctrine was not invented for parades. It was built over 30 years, designed around one specific strategic problem. Iran cannot defeat a U.S. carrier strike group in a conventional naval engagement. It does not have the surface combatants. It does not have the air power. It does not have the long-range strike network. What it has, instead, is geography, mass, and the swarm. The IRGC Navy operates somewhere between 12 and 1,500 small fast craft of varying classes. PACAP-class missile boats carrying Kawsar anti-ship missiles with a range of around 15 miles. Tanda-class craft armed with Chinese-derived C-802 variants reaching out past 70 miles. Ashura and Zulfiqar fast interceptors capable of speeds exceeding 60 knots. Newer Terra-class hulls with reduced radar signatures. And, layered underneath all of them, an expanding fleet of unmanned surface vessels, essentially explosive-laden boats designed to ram their targets at high speed. The doctrine is simple. Saturate, overwhelm, force a defender to expend high-cost interceptors against low-cost attackers until the math breaks. That is a structural problem the United States has been quietly studying for 2 decades. A single rim, 162 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile costs approximately $1.5 million. A standard missile, 2 costs over $2 million. A standard Missile 6, the long-range workhorse of the Aegis combat system, costs more than $4 million per round. An Iranian fast attack boat, built in a coastal workshop with imported diesel engines and a welded steel hull, cost somewhere between $50,000 and $200,000. A drone boat costs less. The cost-exchange ratio is brutal, and Iran knows it. A U.S. Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries 96 vertical launch cells. Not all of them are loaded with anti-air interceptors. A significant portion are reserved for land attack, anti-submarine, and ballistic missile defense roles. In a typical Gulf loadout, the available surface-to-air magazine might hold 60 to 70 interceptors, depending on mission profile. Against a single coordinated swarm of 300 fast craft, even with a 5-inch deck gun, the close-in weapon systems and embarked helicopter support engage simultaneously, the magazine depth becomes a limiting factor within minutes. That is the equation Iran built its entire naval strategy around. Force the defender to run out of bullets before the attacker runs out of boats. And that morning, when Iranian state television broadcast hundreds of those boats in formation, the message to Washington was not about the parade. The message was about the math. But the equation has another layer underneath it, a layer Iran does not control. By the afternoon of that same day, satellite imagery analysts tracking the region noticed 3 movements that did not appear in any official statement. The first was the repositioning of a U.S. Navy Expeditionary Sea base, the kind of platform that functions as a floating forward operating site for Special Operations Forces, mine countermeasures helicopters, and unmanned systems. It shifted south of the strait, into a position roughly equidistant from the Iranian coast and the Omani Musandam Peninsula. The second movement was a quiet redeployment of 2 MQ-9 Reaper drones operating out of Gulf Air Base. Their patrol pattern suddenly altered to provide continuous overwatch on Iranian small craft basing areas at Bandar Abbas, Bandar-e-Jask, and the islands of Abu Musa and the Tons. The third movement was the one that mattered most, and it was the one almost nobody reported. A Virginia-class fast attack submarine, whose previous position had been deliberately obscured, surfaced briefly inside the Gulf of Oman, just long enough to be photographed by a commercial vessel transiting the area. The image circulated for a few hours before being scrubbed from most platforms, but the analysts who saw it understood immediately what it meant. The submarine had not surfaced by accident. It was a signal. Captain James Holloway, a former destroyer commander now serving as a strategic studies fellow, described the logic in a closed-door briefing weeks later. The Iranian swarm doctrine, he explained, depends on one fundamental assumption, that the swarm can launch from sanctuary, that the basing infrastructure, the tunnels, the camouflage piers, the underground storage caverns, will remain untouched until the moment of attack. Remove that assumption, and the entire architecture collapses. That was a visible layer of the U.S. response. The hidden layer sat deeper, because while the surface fleet repositioned and the drones adjusted their orbits, a separate and far quieter capability was activated. The U.S. Fifth Fleet's Task Force 59, the world's first naval unmanned and artificial intelligence integration unit, expanded its operational footprint across the Gulf. Sail drone explorers, low-profile unmanned surface vessels powered by wind and solar, began transmitting continuous imagery and acoustic data from positions inside Iranian small craft transit corridors. Martak-T, 38 Devil Ray catamarans, capable of 60-knot dashes, took up forward picket stations. Aerial unmanned systems coordinated with surface sensors to build a real-time, machine-learning-assisted track on every Iranian hull movement in the strait. The Iranians had revealed their fleet. The Americans had quietly revealed nothing. That asymmetry is the heart of the story. Commander Rachel Vance, an electronic warfare officer with prior deployments aboard cruisers operating in the Gulf, explained the deeper dynamic in stark terms. Iranian fast boats, she noted, depend on 3 things to survive a saturation attack. They need surprise. They need coordinated command and control. And they need their targeting data, which often comes from shore-based radars and observation posts feeding contact information back to the boats via short-range radio links. Take away any one of those 3, and the swarm becomes a crowd. The U.S. Navy has spent over a decade building the tools to attack all 3 simultaneously. EA, 18G Growler electronic attack aircraft based out of regional airfields can blanket Iranian coastal radar frequencies with jamming. SLQ, 32 shipboard electronic warfare suites can disrupt the radio links between Iranian shore controllers and their boats. Cyber capabilities, rarely discussed in open forums, can degrade Iranian command networks in the opening seconds of a contested engagement. What this means in practical terms is that the swarm Iran revealed that morning is only dangerous if it can operate as a swarm. The moment it fragments, the moment its hulls lose their coordinating data, the moment its missile boats cannot get a confirmed targeting solution before launch, it ceases to be a strategic threat and becomes a collection of isolated small craft attacking heavily armed warships individually. And that is where the cost-exchange ratio inverts. A coordinated swarm exhausts a destroyer's magazine. A fragmented swarm gets engaged piecemeal by deck guns, helicopters, and rolling airframe missiles, all of which carry far cheaper rounds. The same boats that represented an existential threat in their mass formation become manageable targets the moment the connective tissue between them is severed. But that was only part of the equation. The real pressure sat underneath it, because the United States was not preparing to defeat the swarm at sea. The United States was preparing, if necessary, to ensure the swarm never left port. This is where the Virginia-class submarine sighting becomes important. Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, launched from submerged platforms, can reach Iranian coastal infrastructure within minutes. Tunnel entrances, fuel depots, command bunkers, and small craft piers all sit within range. The submarine surfacing was not a tactical event. It was a deterrence message, a reminder that the swarm sanctuary is not, in fact, sanctuary. And that changed the geometry. Iran's calculus assumes that escalation moves up a ladder, a provocation, then a response, then a counter-response, with each side managing tempo. But the U.S. response posture that week communicated something different. It communicated that if the swarm was ever ordered to deploy in anger, the first strikes would not happen at sea. They would happen on land, against a basing infrastructure that makes the swarm possible in the first place. That is a different escalation ladder, a steeper one. And Iranian planners understood the message immediately. The Iranian fleet conducted its display for 3 days. Then it returned to port. The U.S. surface vessels remained on station. The drones continued their orbits. The submarine disappeared again beneath the surface, its position once more obscured, and the strait, on paper, returned to a state of uneasy normalcy. But underneath the surface, the equation had shifted. Iran demonstrated that it can generate mass. The United States demonstrated that mass alone is not enough. Iran demonstrated that it can produce hundreds of low-cost platforms. The United States demonstrated that low-cost platforms still depend on high-value infrastructure that cannot be easily replicated. Iran demonstrated will. The United States demonstrated reach. And in the gap between those two demonstrations sits the central unresolved question of the entire Gulf security architecture. What happens when the swarm is ordered to act, not as a parade, but as a weapon? The honest answer is that no one knows for certain. The cost exchange math favors Iran. The electronic warfare math favors the United States. The geographic math favors Iran. The logistical math favors the United States. The political math depends on factors that change week to week, from oil prices to election cycles to the diplomatic posture of the Gulf Cooperation Council states, whose own ports and airfields will become immediately involved in any sustained engagement. What is known is this: the Strait of Hormuz cannot be closed permanently. It can, however, be disrupted. A single confirmed incident in the strait, a tanker strike, a mine detonation, a fast boat ramming attempt, can spike global oil prices by $10 to $15 per barrel within hours. The economic shock alone can ripple through markets faster than any military response can be organized. That is a leverage Iran holds, and that is a leverage every Iranian display of force is designed to reinforce. The United States understands this, which is why the response that week was not loud. It was not theatrical. It did not match Iran's parade with counter-parade. It moved quietly, asymmetrically, and in domains the cameras could not see. That is a doctrine the U.S. Fifth Fleet has refined over 2 decades of Gulf operations. Visible Iranian force is met with hidden American capability. Iranian mass is met with American precision. Iranian theater is met with American silence. And the silence, in the end, was the message. Admiral Brad Cooper, who previously commanded U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, summarized the underlying philosophy in a public address some time ago. The mission, he said, is not to win a war in the Gulf. The mission is to ensure that no one ever decides to start one. Deterrence, he noted, is not measured by what happens. It is measured by what does not happen. By that measure, the week of the Iranian fast boat display ended the way every previous escalation cycle in the Strait has ended, with both sides retreating to their previous postures, with no shots fired, with the global oil supply still flowing, and with the underlying equation, the one that decides whether the next cycle ends the same way, slightly altered in ways that only the analysts watching the deep data will fully understand. Iran revealed hundreds of fast assault boats. The United States revealed almost nothing. And in that asymmetry sits the real story of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz. The visible layer was the parade. The hidden layer was the response. And the question that still hangs over the strait, the one that no public broadcast will ever answer, is the only one that actually matters. What happens the next time Iran rolls those boats out? And the order is not to return to port. The boats are still there. The tunnels are still there. The submarines are still there. The drones are still there. The math is still there. And the strait, 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, still carries 1/5 of the world's oil every single day, through waters where the visible story is almost never the real one. If this kind of strategic analysis is the layer you want to keep watching, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the operational reality underneath the headlines, and check the next video in the series for what comes after the swarm.